Nobody inside the palace expected William to make the first move, and certainly not one this severe. But after years of remaining controlled whenever Diana's memory collided with the realities of the modern monarchy, the prince finally reached his limit. In a private meeting that suddenly became impossible to contain, William delivered a decision concerning Camilla that stunned Charles, froze the senior royals into silence, and transformed an old family wound into an open confrontation. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William had spent his adult life learning how to divide grief from duty. Diana was not simply a famous royal figure to him, she was his mother, the woman whose absence shaped every stage of his life. Yet as the future king, he had also been trained to protect the institution that once struggled to understand her. That tension had forced him into silence before. This time, silence was over. Camilla understood the danger immediately. Her place beside Charles had become part of the monarchy's present structure, and challenging her influence could never remain a private family disagreement. The family council, an internal group meant to guide sensitive family matters, would deal with Diana's legacy, the ceremonial roles of George, Charlotte, and Louis, and decisions affecting the next generation. William stated plainly that Camilla would no longer sit on it. Camilla leaned forward, certain there was room to negotiate. She told William the decision could be reconsidered. He did not raise his voice. He did not retreat. The prince answered that the matter had already been decided, and the calmness in his tone made the words more unsettling than anger would have. Charles felt the room change. He lowered the folder in his hands, set it on the table, and asked his son whether he understood what he was doing. William met the king's eyes without hesitation. He said he understood completely. The monarch heard more than defiance in that answer. He heard finality. William then revealed why the boundary had been drawn. Something Camilla had recently said about Diana had crossed a line he could no longer ignore. He refused to repeat the full remark in front of everyone. But he made one thing clear. Nobody would decide what place his mother should hold in the lives of his children. Anne said nothing, yet her silence carried weight. She already knew the words that had triggered him. She had been there when they were spoken. And before William's decision could truly be understood, the history connecting him, Diana, Charles, and Camilla had to be confronted. For William, this was never simply about removing someone from a council. Every word spoken in that room carried decades of memory behind it. Diana's absence, Charles's choices, Camilla's transformation from controversial figure to queen, and William's own struggle to protect his children from inheriting unresolved family pain. Beneath the crowns and titles were three people confronting a history none of them could rewrite, and one woman whose memory still possessed extraordinary emotional power. William stood between two generations, and that made every decision heavier. He was Charles's heir, Diana's eldest son, Catherine's husband, and father to George, Charlotte, and Louis. An heir is the person expected to inherit the throne, but for him the role carried something more painful: the duty to protect the monarchy, while also protecting his own family from wounds created inside it. The future king could not separate those responsibilities anymore. Charles felt trapped by the same history from the opposite side. Supporting Camilla meant defending the woman who had remained beside him through years of criticism. Yet opposing William meant risking a fracture with the son who would one day carry the crown after him. The king understood that this was no ordinary disagreement. If he pushed too hard, he could turn an argument about Diana into a lasting break between father and son. William remembered Diana differently from everyone else. To the world, she had become an icon, a symbol, a chapter discussed. To him, she was his mother. That difference burned whenever her memory was reduced to strategy, protocol, or palace language. Catherine found him after the confrontation, standing beside a family photograph, silent and rigid. She asked whether he was certain. William answered that certainty was exactly why he had acted. Camilla felt the past closing around her again. After leaving the meeting, she sat alone while an aide asked whether she wanted tea. The queen consort, the title given to the wife of a reigning king, did not answer at first. When she finally did, her voice was low. She knew this was not merely about one council seat. Old judgment had returned, and this time it was coming from inside the family. Anne understood that too. In a private conversation with Edward, she told him William's anger had not begun that morning. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally granted to the monarch's eldest daughter, had watched the distance grow for weeks. Edward asked what had changed. Anne paused before answering. One sentence had done it. That sentence would become the point of no return, because weeks earlier, during one private family gathering, Diana's name had been spoken, and William had heard something he could never forget. The confrontation did not begin inside a formal council chamber. It began weeks earlier during a smaller family gathering, when conversation unexpectedly turned toward Diana and the way her memory should be handled during future royal commemorations. What followed lasted only minutes. Yet for William, one exchange became impossible to forget. Anne noticed his expression immediately. Catherine noticed the silence afterward. And Camilla, perhaps without realizing it, had triggered something that could not be reversed. William had entered the dinner determined to keep the discussion practical. Charles, Camilla, Catherine, Anne, and Edward were there to talk about future family commemorations and how Diana's place should be explained to George's generation. A royal commemoration is an act of remembrance marking a person or anniversary, but William wanted something less managed. He argued that his mother belonged inside the family's private memory, for his children, not inside a controlled palace narrative. Camilla listened, then answered with the sentence that changed everything. She said the monarchy could not remain emotionally governed by a chapter that ended decades ago, and suggested Diana's role should be limited in internal commemorations involving William's children. The Queen Consort tried to make the argument sound practical. William heard something else. He heard his mother reduced to history, and worse, he heard someone else claiming the right to decide how much of that history his children were allowed to inherit. William stopped speaking. Catherine saw his hand tighten around the stem of his glass, and she understood that the remark had gone deeper than anger. Charles understood it too. The king shifted toward Camilla, but before he could intervene, Anne broke the silence. She told the room that Diana was not merely a chapter to her sons. Edward stayed quiet, watching William instead of the table. Camilla began to explain herself, but the prince cut her off softly. No clarification was necessary, he said. Anne found William alone later that evening. In a private conversation with no aides present, she told him that silence did not always protect the monarchy. Sometimes, she warned, silence allowed resentment to harden into policy. William listened without arguing. The Princess Royal had not told him what to do, but she had named the danger he had spent years avoiding. William made no scene that night. Catherine watched him return home quieter than before, while Charles remained troubled by what had been said. Camilla believed the moment would pass. It did not. William began preparing a structural response that would remove her influence from decisions involving Diana's legacy. Weeks later, that restrained silence would finally break, and when William and Camilla met face to face, neither would be willing to retreat. There were no cameras, no public statements, and no ceremonial smiles when William confronted Camilla directly. Behind a closed palace door, years of careful restraint finally gave way to words that could never be withdrawn. She entered believing the council decision was political. William told her it was personal. She defended herself. He refused to soften his position. And when Diana's name entered the conversation again, the exchange ceased to be about protocol and became something far more dangerous, a son's reckoning. Camilla had requested the meeting because she still believed the decision could be contained. Charles stayed away deliberately, leaving the two of them without a mediator. The Queen Consort argued that removing her from the family council created a dangerous precedent. A precedent is a decision that can shape how similar situations are handled later, and she warned that private resentment was now being turned into an official family structure. To her, that risk went beyond wounded feelings. William listened without interrupting. Then he made the distinction she had feared. This was not about her marriage to Charles. It was not about her title, her public role, or her place beside the king. The prince said the line had been crossed when she tried to define what place Diana should hold in the lives of George, Charlotte, and Louis. His voice stayed controlled, but the message was brutal in its clarity. Camilla rose from her chair and insisted he had misunderstood her intention. William remained seated for several long seconds before standing. He told her that intention could not erase impact. She answered that he was punishing the present for pain created in the past. The future king did not flinch. He said he was doing the opposite. He was protecting the future from having the past rewritten by people who had not lived his grief. Camilla pressed harder. She asked whether Diana's memory would now become a permanent weapon against her. William rejected the accusation immediately. He said his mother was not a weapon. She was family. That difference, he told her, was exactly what she had failed to understand. William then gave her the revelation that changed the balance of the meeting. Anne had independently supported removing Camilla from decisions concerning Diana's legacy. The Princess Royal had reached that position without being pressured, and she had told him privately that his boundary was justified. Camilla fell silent. William's anger was no longer the greatest danger. Other senior royals might agree with him. And once he realized he was not standing alone, the confrontation stopped being personal and became a genuine struggle over influence inside the family. William's decision might have collapsed under royal pressure if he had stood alone. He did not. Princess Anne's intervention changed the balance completely. She was not driven by nostalgia, nor was she interested in reopening every wound surrounding Diana. Her argument was colder and therefore more powerful. William had the right to define how his mother's legacy reached his children. When Charles realized Anne agreed with his son, the dispute suddenly became impossible to dismiss as emotional rebellion. Anne carried unusual weight inside the family, because duty had always defined her public life. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, was known for discipline rather than sentiment, which made her support difficult to dismiss. Edward remained cautious and pushed for compromise, while Catherine stood firmly behind William's right to draw boundaries around George, Charlotte, and Louis. The argument was no longer one man's anger. It was becoming a family position. Charles summoned Anne privately because he needed to know how far that support went. The king asked whether she understood how personally Camilla was taking the exclusion. Anne answered that William was experiencing the deeper issue personally too. She reminded him that the dispute concerned a mother, a son, and the right of that son to decide how his children understood their grandmother. Charles moved toward the window and removed his glasses. He said nothing for several moments. Anne did not soften her point. She told him that defending his wife did not require overruling his son's boundaries, and that forcing William to accept Camilla's influence in this one area would only deepen resentment. The monarch listened because he knew she was not asking him to choose Diana over Camilla. She was asking him to recognize where his authority should stop. Anne left him with the decision. Charles remained alone with the council papers, the documents setting out who would participate in sensitive family discussions. He picked up a pen, circled Camilla's name once, then slowly drew a line through it. There was no fury in the gesture. That made it more devastating. The king had not defeated his wife. He had accepted his son's boundary. Charles then gave formal approval for the arrangement to stand. William now had something he had not possessed before: the monarch's backing. Catherine understood what that meant immediately. While Edward realized compromise had effectively disappeared, Anne had shifted the balance without raising her voice. Camilla still did not know. For her, losing the argument to William would be painful. Discovering that Charles had allowed the decision to stand would be something far more personal. Camilla had expected resistance from William. What she had not expected was surrender from Charles. When confirmation finally reached her that the king would not overturn his son's decision, the emotional reality changed instantly. This was no longer a temporary dispute that could be managed through private conversation. William had drawn a boundary, Anne had defended it, and Charles had accepted it. For the first time, Camilla understood that royal rank could not protect her from every consequence of the past. Charles chose to tell her himself. He refused to let an aide carry a message this personal, and when he sat down opposite her, she already sensed what was coming. The king explained that the family council, a private group used to discuss sensitive matters affecting relatives and future royal responsibilities, would proceed without her. He stressed that her wider role beside him remained unchanged. The exclusion applied only to Diana's private legacy and to how William's children understood their grandmother. Camilla listened until he finished, then asked the question Charles had been dreading. Did he agree with William? The monarch hesitated. That hesitation hurt more than an immediate answer. Finally, he said he agreed that his son had the right to set this boundary. She stared at him as though the words had created a distance between them that neither had expected to feel. Camilla removed a bracelet from her wrist and placed it slowly on the table. She asked whether decades of loyalty meant nothing the moment Diana's name entered the room. Charles answered that this was not about loyalty. He reminded her that William was not trying to erase her place beside him. The prince was defending a place inside his own family that he believed belonged only to his mother. Camilla said nothing after that. Charles stayed with her for several moments, but he knew there was nothing left to negotiate. When the king finally left, she remained seated alone. Anger came first, sharp and familiar. Then something quieter replaced it. She could challenge policy. She could argue over influence. But she could not negotiate William out of remembering Diana as his mother. Camilla chose not to retaliate. Instead, she wrote William a short handwritten request asking for one final private conversation. Not about the council, not about titles, about Diana. William nearly refused when the message reached him. Catherine read his expression and told him to read it again before deciding. He did. The conflict had reached its lowest point, but one private conversation, with no king, no aides, and no council papers, was about to change what this battle truly meant. The most important moment in the entire confrontation happens without an audience. No Charles, no Anne, no courtiers waiting outside to shape the outcome. William and Camilla sit opposite one another, carrying two entirely different versions of the same painful history. He arrives determined not to reverse his decision. She arrives knowing she cannot force him to. For the first time, neither is fighting for authority. They are simply confronting what Diana's memory means to two people who can never experience it in the same way. William agreed to the meeting with one condition: the council decision would not be reopened. Camilla accepted before they sat down. The family council, a private group used to discuss sensitive family matters, would remain exactly as decided. That mattered because William needed her to understand that this conversation was not another attempt to bargain over influence. It was about something deeper and far more personal. Camilla spoke first. She admitted that her remark at the earlier dinner had been meant to separate institutional planning from emotion. The queen consort said she had believed the monarchy needed clear boundaries around remembrance. But as she explained herself, she also admitted the mistake. She had spoken as though Diana's place inside William's family belonged to the institution rather than to him. William answered slowly. His deepest anger, he said, came from imagining George, Charlotte, and Louis growing up with the idea that their grandmother was a difficult chapter the family had moved beyond. The prince could accept public debate, criticism, even disagreement. What he could not accept was his children being taught to inherit distance from a woman they had never been given the chance to know. Camilla lowered her voice. That was not mine to decide. William did not answer immediately. Several seconds passed before he nodded. The future king did not restore her place on the council, and she did not ask again. Yet something inside the conversation changed. They stopped arguing over who had won and began defining where the boundary would permanently stand. Camilla promised she would never again interfere with how William presented Diana's memory to his children. He, in return, promised that the boundary would not be turned into a campaign to humiliate her publicly. Neither offered forgiveness. Neither pretended the past had disappeared, but both accepted a truth that had been impossible to say aloud before. The agreement had barely settled when the outside world learned fragments of the decision. Inside the palace, the boundary was finally understood. Outside its gates, however, William's private act was about to be interpreted as something far more explosive, and the reaction would be immediate, emotional, unforgiving. By morning, what had begun as a private family boundary had become a national royal drama. Commentators framed William's decision as everything from an act of filial loyalty to the most dramatic assertion of his authority in years. Diana's name dominated the conversation once again. Camilla's position was dissected. Charles's silence became a story of its own. Yet one image outside Kensington Palace captured the public mood more powerfully than columns, broadcasts, or palace statements ever could. William learned quickly that the private settlement would not stay private. Newspapers and broadcasters focused on one fact. Camilla had been excluded specifically from decisions concerning Diana's legacy and the way George, Charlotte, and Louis would understand their grandmother. Palace staff answered with careful restraint, calling it a private family decision about responsibilities. A palace statement, an official message issued on behalf of the royal household, offered no details and no criticism. That silence only made the story louder. Outside Kensington Palace, the emotion became impossible to contain. A small crowd gathered beside the gates, and one woman placed a bouquet beneath a photograph of Diana, with a handwritten message. "A mother is never a chapter." Cameras captured it within minutes. The image spread across broadcasts and front pages because it reduced the entire dispute to something simple. For many watching, William was no longer defending protocol. He was defending memory. William saw the photograph during a briefing and stopped speaking. Catherine noticed him stare at the tablet before setting it down. The princess understood why those 6 words affected him more than hours of commentary. They echoed the wound at the center of the conflict. William had spent years living with Diana as a public symbol, but this message returned her to the one role that mattered most to him: mother. Camilla watched the coverage alone for several minutes before switching off the television. The Queen Consort had accepted William's private boundary, but the public interpretation was harsher than the agreement they had reached. She realized that outside the palace, nuance had disappeared. The story had become victory and defeat, loyalty and betrayal. Charles faced pressure to respond. Advisors suggested he publicly rebuke William to defend Camilla, but the king refused. His silence now meant something different. By declining to challenge his son, he signaled that the boundary would remain permanent. The noise slowly began to fade. Yet one question remained. William had won the argument, Camilla had accepted the limit, and Charles had allowed it to stand. But victory alone was not the ending. The palace had been left speechless. Only when the anger settled would the true meaning of William's decision finally become clear. In the end, William's victory was not the destruction of Camilla, nor was it the public humiliation of Charles's wife. It was something more personal and permanent. For years, Diana's memory had existed at the intersection of grief, controversy, monarchy, and history. William finally removed part of that legacy from negotiation. Whatever the palace chose to say about the past, his mother would remain his children's grandmother, and nobody else would decide how deeply she belonged within their family. William allowed the family council to continue with Catherine, Anne, Charles, and relatives involved. The council, a private group guiding sensitive decisions, would discuss responsibilities affecting the next generation, but Camilla would remain outside conversations concerning Diana's personal legacy. That boundary mattered because it separated public monarchy from private memory. For William, the crown could advise on duty, but it could not decide how his children understood their grandmother. Charles accepted the arrangement permanently. The king knew he might never share his son's anger, yet he understood the cost of overruling him. Protecting his relationship with William required respecting a limit he had once hoped could be negotiated. Camilla did not receive the reversal she wanted, but her final private conversation with the prince gave her something different: clarity. She understood that this was not a campaign to destroy her. It was a line she could no longer cross. William later stood with George beside a photograph of Diana. The boy asked a simple question about what his grandmother had been like. William answered without hesitation. He did not reach for palace language, historical explanations, or balanced phrases. He spoke as a son. George listened as a grandson. In that small exchange, the future king understood what the confrontation meant. William no longer saw his decision as revenge. Honoring Diana did not require fighting Camilla forever, nor did it mean forcing Charles to relive every wound of the past. It meant protecting his mother's rightful place inside his family, and refusing to let old pain become inherited silence. The confrontation changed the internal balance forever. When Catherine, his children, or Diana's legacy were involved, William had shown that palace harmony would not override his responsibilities as husband, father, and son. The palace had been left speechless because William confronted history, drew a boundary, endured the consequences, and stopped fighting once that boundary was respected. William did not rewrite Diana's story, erase Camilla, or defeat his father. He made one truth permanent: the crown could manage history, but it would never again decide how a son remembered his mother. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.